Appreciate you all being here once again as we continue in our period of worship to our God. It's always a little disjarring when I look up and the audience is here and not everywhere. There's something about Jesus said, I think, about the goats being on the left and sheep on the right or vice versa. I don't know if that meant from my view or your view, so move appropriately on that. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 tonight to begin with. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 10. Now, as you're turning there, conscience would tell me that I need to state this up front. The old saying holds true, if there's one finger pointed at the audience, there's four back at me. Well, if I could put all five back at me tonight, I would do so. This is a topic that I myself, every sermon is preached to myself, but this one especially so, and it's a lesson that we all need to hear. And so starting then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 10, speaking of Israel's mistakes and what they stand as a warning for to the Corinthians and for us, Paul says in the 10th verse of 1 Corinthians 10, "Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." The thing we want to pay attention to is verse 10. "Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer." If you were to ask somebody, or you ask me what America's pastime is, you might think baseball. Really, it's complaining. Our whole revolution was fought originally because we complained about taxes being too high, and we complained that there was no representation, and we complained that no one was listening to our complaints. And it's just been a national pastime since then. We complain about everything. Those of you who got to hear lessons from Brother Mark Russell at Northside's Gospel, and he made a really good point. Think about the epitome of privilege and Western riches in this scenario, because I think we've all been there. We will be in our brand new air-conditioned car with comfortable seats, wearing good clothing, and we have the AC blowing on us. We'll pull into McDonald's where I don't have to do all the gathering of the food. I don't have to cook it. All I have to say is I want the number 2 extra large. I'm here. And they'll take 2 seconds too long, and I will gripe, and I will complain in the drive-thru because my fast food is not fast enough. It's a problem. And it's a problem for the Lord's people as well. Because oftentimes what shoots a congregation in its foot when it's on the verge of greatness and growth and potential is complaining. We won't see the fact that, for many brethren who are fortunate enough to have elders, they'll complain at every decision the elders do. And they'll be blind to the fact that they have elders. We'll complain that the preacher didn't say it just right when we're not the one up there preaching. And I could go on and on. I'm reminded of Teddy Roosevelt's speech. It was on citizenship in the republic, but it's been popularized as the man in the arena. And in that speech, in that part, where he'll say, it's not the critic who counts, who is not in the arena, and I'm butchering this speech, but he says, the one who has not given his blood, sweat, or tears, who tries and tries again. His whole point is it's easier to cast blame and grumble than to actually go out and do something. And so tonight, I just want to look at what does the Bible have to say about this and consider some various verses about it. And I'm going to try and do very little editorializing on this. I think the scriptures speak plainly for themselves. But first of all, though, why this lesson? Other than Brenden complaining about complaining. Well, first of all, sins of the tongue are so easily committed. So easily. James has a lot to say about that. If you want to turn to James chapter 3, starting in verse 2 and 3. James chapter 3, looking at verses 2 through 5 there. After his warning about not let many of you become teachers, he says this, "For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. If we put the bits into the horses' mouths so they will obey us, we would direct their entire body also. Look at the ships also, though they are great and driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder whenever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire." Now, James's teaching here is largely in the negative of how much damage the tongue can do. You know, the old saying goes of, we were taught in school, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. And that works because it rhymes. But if you want a more accurate one, is sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will leave deep, lasting emotional scars. But that doesn't rhyme, and kids can't remember that. Words leave lasting impact. And grumbling, murmuring, complaining, it's sins of the tongue. And they have deep impacts upon everyone who hears it. Because our complaining is never just us. And sin is never just a you and your sin's affair. Sin has ripple effects, and somebody will be affected by our complaining. As we've been elaborating on, words do matter. Just very quickly turn over to Matthew chapter 12 and looking at verses 36 and 37. And if you have not already highlighted or marked these verses in some way, I would highly encourage you to do so. Jesus, in teaching how our words reveal our character, our inner person, what really is us, the substance of us. He speaks of these points, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart, speaking of its words. If they're good, it reflects a good character, and vice versa. But he says in verse 36, "But I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." Well, this is why we're speaking on this lesson tonight. Sins of the tongue are very easy to commit, and we have to be careful with our words. And I was mentioned to a brother before I got up here tonight, congregation, we're growing right now. We're having what I call growth pains. There's some friction about, okay, we're right at the breaking point. We need to have another kids class. We're trying to get more men involved in teaching. These are signs of growth, but with growth there comes growth pains. I remember as being a hyper-imaginative child, when I would feel growth pains in my chest, for some reason 10-year-old me thought that it was a heart attack. Sometimes growth is not comfortable, but it's good. But with growth pains, sometimes there's complaints. And we have to make sure we're airing those complaints rightly and not sinfully. So very quickly, I just want to go over what the meaning of the word is before we jump into some Old Testament scriptures and look at some of the New Testament scriptures. What is murmuring? The modern translations will have grumbling or complaining or murmuring, and some of the older ones. They all are basically, they're used interchangeably in our English translations, but they get to the heart of the same word. In fact, the Greek word kind of borrowed its meaning from the Hebrew word when they're translated to for the text, because they're so similar in the meaning. So mainly in the Old Testament, it denotes the semi-articulated mutterings of disaffected persons. Okay, what does that mean in English? Murmur, murmur, murmur. Much like my dad fixing the car or something, you hear him go, you just hear these mumbling murmurings, he's not happy. And that's what, another preacher articulated the point that murmuring is like you're in a crowded room, and there's that loud, soft ambiance of thousand voices talking, like you walking in an airport or something like that. All these conversations are going on, and you can't understand a single word that's being said. It's also used in several other places, added the meaning of malicious whispering of slander. And sinful murmuring, complaining up at the forefront, it's on the screen, but would be a direct violation of Matthew 18. Because instead of actually going to your brother about the issue you might have or your concern, you'll murmur, or you'll lean over to your pew mate and go, brother so-and-so, he butchered those songs tonight. And instead of actually bringing up your concern with your brother, it says, well, what happened? We'll talk to everybody else in the plant before we go to them. In the New Testament, it often means indignation and fault-finding. None of these are positive things that we want to be involved in. So, of the Old Testament passages, this list is not exhaustive, by the way, because, we'd be here all night if it were. But I've selected 4 key ones, and we're going to be starting off in Exodus 15 with the first complaint, there's no water. So in Exodus chapter 15, if you want to turn there right now, this comes right after they've been delivered from Israel. Israel has seen the great plagues and the mighty working of God, his justice and his wrath, his goodness and severity. Israelites were spared in the final plague. Egypt was judged. They saw the waters parted. They knew they served a miraculous, all-powerful God who had plans for them, who was making good on his covenant promise to Abraham to bring them out into the land of promise. So it should be smooth sailing, right? Well, let's get to verse 24. Let's go to verse 22 for context of Exodus 15. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" They cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed them a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. Notice that's after they grumble and complain instead of actually just going directly to God about it. But think about that. They've just seen everything that God can do, and they get a little thirsty. Just a little bit. Well, there's no water to drink. What are you going to do about it, Moses? Is your problem? Again, had they not just seen what God can do? That didn't really cross their minds to ask God what to do. They grumbled at Moses. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree and made the water sweet. The rest of verse 25. He made for them a statute and a regulation, therefore he tested them. And he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, to do what was right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. So they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. Okay, maybe the first one's understandable. Okay, they see the plagues, and they maybe get that, and they're in the middle of a desert after all. I mean, how many of us would feel comfortably starting getting thirsty if you were dropped out beyond civilization down, outside of Wilcox or something, where there's no green as far as the eye can see? Might be understandable. But then we get to the next one, which is only a couple verses later. So God makes deadly water into drinkable, and then leads them to 12 springs of water where there's date palms. I don't know if you had a date. I haven't had one yet. But I was told they're very similar to figs, very sweet. They're a very sweet fruit. It's God's basically saying, I've given you these 12 springs of water, and as a kicker, I've given you some pleasures here as well to enjoy and refresh yourself with. Extra blessing, if you will. So we've already done that, and now we get to Exodus 16, verses 2 through 12, and you're like, okay, this is cool. I'm hungry. What are you going to do about it, Moses? No, they keep directing their complaints. Picking up at verse 2. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, where we sat by pots of meat when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out in the wilderness to kill us as a whole assembly with hunger. I'm going to pause there. Israel as a whole is the most ornery, cranky, fussy toddler in the Bible. Because all they can focus on is the immediate need, to the point where they're blinded to the previous blessings and goodness of God. And that's what complaining does. Complaining hyperfixates on the minute in the moment. It exaggerates the problem. It blinds you to God's blessing and His goodness. And it puts you in the place of the victim. I mean, this is the generation who just a month ago or so, let's be generous, maybe 2 months ago, they were in slavery. They were being beaten. Their children were being killed. Their burdens were being heavied up. And here they say, would we have stayed in Egypt where there was pots of meat? One of the most sickening things I've ever seen is actually a bucket of meat. And it was on Channel 13, Dirty Dining. I had just gone to Miss Saigon on the east side, and lo and behold, it was Miss Saigon on Dirty Dining, and they had buckets of meat in their meat freezer. Needless to say, I thank God that I did not get food poisoning, and needless to say, I did not go back there. But every time I read buckets of meat now, or pots of meat, I think of Miss Saigon's buckets of meat. It's not appealing. It's not appetizing. And you can guarantee that this would not have been the good meat in Egypt too. Why would they give the good meat to the slaves? They're slaves after all. You know, it's the Egyptians. We're trying to get rid of them. Short-sighted. Let's pick up in verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will obey and walk in my instruction. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, at evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord, and what you are that you grumble against us. He hears your grumbling against the Lord, and what are we that you grumble against us? Moses said, thus will happen when the Lord gives you meat and to eat in the evening, and bread to the full in the morning. For the Lord hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. And what are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord. We have more to read, but I just want to make this point real quick on this. The text is very clear. They grumbled against Moses in Exodus 15. They grumbled against Moses beginning in Exodus 16. They grumbled against Moses, against Moses, against Moses. And here God reveals through Moses, you have not been complaining against Moses. You've been complaining against God, against his plans, his blessings, his goodness. And I know we haven't even got to the New Testament part yet, but I would suggest to you that sometimes our complaints today, we may say they're against such and such, or against so-and-so, when really they're against God. We might complain that, some brethren might complain that they don't like the eldership. Well, those are God-ordained, appointed elders because they have met the qualifications. You're complaining against God. There's a similar parallel to that in 1 Samuel 8. When they reject Samuel as being judge, God assures Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. Because they've rejected the system that God placed them under. Maybe a little bit more safe example. Many people complain against God when they are dissatisfied with the pattern and that God has given for his church or his work. And they think they can supplement it for something else. It's funny, every time brethren or people try and do that, it always crashes and burns. It may take a couple decades, but it always does. They grumbled against the Lord when they thought they were grumbling against Moses. Picking up in verse 9. So Moses said to Aaron, say to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumblings. It came about as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord met Moses, saying, I have heard the grumblings of the sons of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And one last point here before we move on. How many times in this short section have we read that the Lord has heard your grumblings? Our murmurings and complainings are not simply things that only we hear or the person we're talking to hears. God hears every single complaint. And God makes judgment on every single complaint. I would suggest to you that's in there in the meaning of what we read in Matthew chapter 12, 36 through 37. We'll give an account for that. We'll give an account for that. Well, we're not done yet. We get to Numbers 11, and I really could not come up with a funny way of saying this other than they're just complaining for the sake of complaining at this point. In Numbers 11, we need to note the fact that even God had a limit on hearing the complaints. So Numbers chapter 11, again, we're very far removed from the Exodus at this point. In Numbers chapter 11, starting in verse 1. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard of it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of the place was called Tibra, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. The NIV has, they complained about their hardships. They were playing the victim woe is me card. And I say that because let's consider what God did for them in the wilderness. Their shoes would not wear out. Their clothing would never tatter. They had bread as much as they could eat in the morning, and they had meat every night. God provided their water. He provided their safety, their comfort, their direction. They had no adversity other than that which was self-inflicted. Again, I go back to me and my love-hate relationship with orange chicken at Panda Express. It's self-inflicted. I know this. Israel just never got to that point where they understood that this was self-inflicted upon them. Because you had other people in Israel, mainly Moses, Caleb, and Joshua. And Moses had his fault there at the end, but Caleb and Joshua, for as far as we know, was like, this is great. Everything's fine. God feeds us every day. I'm clothed. I have a nice tent. God takes care of everything. What's there to complain about? And they suffer the dire consequences. Now, we're not done yet. Pick up at verse 4. Then the rabble who were among them had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? Hold up. God was already given them meat to eat. Do you ever do that sometimes when you read scriptures? You read it across a statement, you're like, hang on a second. Yeah, that's right. Wasn't God giving you meat all the way back in Exodus? And yet, here we go again, misremembering Egypt. Verse 5, we remember the fish in which we used to eat for free in Egypt, and the cucumbers, and the melons, and the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. And now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna. I don't mean to be that guy. But fish, melons, garlics, leeks, and onions. Those are great garnishes. Those add flavor to some dishes, but if that's your whole diet, their breath must have been awful. And they're complaining about, I don't have all this stuff. The fish that was for free. Well, you're getting free manna here too. I mean, you consider again, we note here again the short-sightedness, the hyperinflation of what the issue actually is, and the blinding of themselves about the goodness of God and his blessings. And then we get to the rebellion in Numbers 14, which can be simply summed up as, I don't know why God put Moses in charge. He does not know what he's doing. And that came from, well, his own siblings too. Numbers chapter 14, let's look at the first 4 verses. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. All the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we have died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not have been better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us appoint a leader to return to Egypt. Notice even in their complaint, they won't take ownership. They won't come out and say, we're just going to go back to Egypt. No. We want a leader so we can grumble against them. And we can lay everything on them, because if they went back to Egypt, they were going to have trouble going back to Egypt anyway. But let's think about that real quick. They showed up at Egypt's doorstep again. The slave people who destroyed the entire military, who decimated the entire generation. That's how the Egyptians would see it. And they're showing back on the doorstep. Egypt goes, no. You're all dying. Because you killed all of our firstborns, you did all this stuff. So again, the distorted view that you get when you complain. Now look at verse 7. They sent spies in the land, and they spoke to the whole congregation, that is Caleb and Joshua. The land which we pass through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. And there they bring the example of the fruit and the grapes and how massive they are and the goodness of the land. But then we have a problem. The malcontents are going to malcontent. And you go in verse 30 to verse 37. After the malcontents have stirred the people to convince them that they don't want to go into this land that God had promised them, read in verse 30. Surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Your children, however, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring them in, and they will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness. Your sons will be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the wilderness. According to the number of days which you have spied out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt, a year, even 40 years, and you shall know my opposition. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this I will do to all this evil generation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they will be destroyed, and there they will die. As for the men whom Moses sent out to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation grumble against him by bringing out a bad report concerning the land, even those men who brought out a very bad report of the land died by a plague before the Lord. I don't often throw cartoons in sermons, but I saw this one and it just summarized everything perfectly. Israel for 40 years. Are we there yet? I have to pee. I don't like the manna. Is it vegan? Is it gluten-free? I mean, we make light of that, but think about what Moses had to listen to for 40 years. What God had to listen to for longer than 40 years. Those of you with children who have gone on road trips might empathize a little bit with this situation. That's why it was always weird. My dad thought we spent way too much time on our Game Boys and video games and everything growing up until it came time for a road trip. Then he made sure the Game Boys were charged up so we would be distracted the entire way down to California. But he did not want to hear, quit touching me, don't pick my nose, don't do that, he hit me, he licked me. That's what God was hearing in the wilderness. So what have we learned so far? Complaining denies the goodness and blessings of God. In every case, their complaint blinded them to what God had already previously done and was going to do, and actually was in the middle of doing. He was in the middle of bringing them out of Egypt to bring them to the land of promise. Numbers 14. If they had not rebelled in Numbers 14, and that bad report, now I don't know the alternate futures, but there was a good chance they would have entered the land in their lifetimes. But because they rebelled, and because they grumbled against the Lord and rebelled and rejected the land, God said, fine, you don't get it. And what I find humorous after that is they turn around and say, oh, no, we're just kidding. We want to take the land. And some of them went to go try and take the land, and they were decimated. Because God said, you're not going to take it. And it wasn't going to happen. Complaining always exaggerates the problem, and it contaminates others. It was only a handful of men with the bad report. And with that bad report, they convinced the whole congregation to grumble against the Lord. And so the whole nation then had to suffer the consequences because these individuals decide, we don't want to go. And they complained about it. I know it's interesting. Gossip, complaining, they're like conjoined twins. But so often, our gossip takes the form of complaint. And so often we will complain as if though we're gossips and not talk to the person we have the problem with. And that is a cancerous poison in the congregation. It's cancerous poison anywhere. And somebody will always be influenced by our complaining. Always. Now, we'll get this to the end, but there is a legitimate way to issue complaint. Acts chapter 6, for example, with the Grecian widows, the Hebrew widows. But it's interesting there, if you look at the word there for complaint, it's not the same one that has the negative connotations. It's to bring up an issue before somebody else. And it was simply, hey, our people are being overlooked. What can be done about this? There was an attitude of there, let's fix the problem. Numbers 11, complaining for the sake of complaining. I just like to complain, is what we see with the children of Israel. Now we go to some New Testament passages. In the parable of the workers, in Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20 here, Jesus tells this parable. Now, the lesson of the parable is that no matter when you come to the kingdom, whether you work all your life or you work only a few days before you're called home, the reward is the same. But I find it interesting that you do find this statement in verse 11, that when it came time to pay wages for the day, you had some who had been there since sunrise, you had some who had been there since lunch, and you had some who had only been there an hour. And the master started paying the guys who had been there an hour, and it was one denarii. That was a day's wages. So the guy who worked at noon thought, oh, well, if the hour guy got a denarii, I might get a denarii and maybe half a denarii. And the guy at the end's probably thinking, if he got a denarii, I might get two of them. And they all found out, no, you all get one. And when they received it in verse 11, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, these last men have worked only 1 hour. And you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day. But he answered and said to them, friend, am I doing you no wrong? Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go, but I wish to give the last man the same as you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous? So the last shall be first and the first last. Brother Ricky Jenkins, preaching a sermon on the same topic, told of a Christian he knew at the congregation where he preached. So she lived in this apartment complex that's owned by a non-Christian, and this non-Christian had never once raised the rent in all the years she lived there, and she was a widow on fixed income. But when she got cancer, she told the congregation, don't give up on the owner, don't give up, still talk to him, still preach the gospel to them. And about 2 or 3 months, I forget what it was, after this woman got cancer, the owner of the apartment complex obeyed the gospel. It was a great thing. And about 3 weeks later, Ricky gets a phone call in his office. Says, that woman we just baptized 3 weeks ago, she dropped dead on her steering wheel today on his way to the grocery store. She'd only been in Christian 3 weeks. But her reward is the same as your and I's reward, who might have been laboring 40 or 50 years. But she died in faith. Now that's the point of the parable. But I'll make a principled application here too, where sometimes Christians can complain. Sometimes the workers can complain about the non-workers, or what the workers perceive as non-workers. Let's be clear about that. Perceive as non-workers. Case in point, I guess, growing up, I've used T. Kent as an example before. Well, his brother Jim Kent, when I met them, if I didn't know about it, I said they were high school classmates with Methuselah. That they were old men to me. And when I saw them, they couldn't get up and preach anymore. They couldn't get up and lead singing anymore. They couldn't do anything other than show up. Now, the wrongful complaint would be, well, they don't do anything. All they do is show up. The mature understanding is they had their time of service. They gave a lot to the Lord, and Jim still does in his 93rd or 4th year. But sometimes Christians, especially the workers, can feel like I'm the only one doing anything. And it's very important when we start feeling that way, we need to step back, reframe, and actually start listing out what we know our brethren are doing so we can realize that, oh no, I'm not the only one doing everything. It's a very humbling exercise, by the way. But some want to grumble. Some want to grumble. Jesus, the Pharisees complained against him because he ate with sinners. In Luke, the 15th chapter, in verse 2, in fact, we dealt with something similar to this morning in Bible class when we're studying Mark chapter 1 and 2. We look in Luke chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, excuse me. Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near to him to listen. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." We may mention this morning in Bible class that Pharisees had this idea that in order to be righteous, you had to make sure that you kept your distance from the people who need to know God the most, and you made sure that they knew how lost they were, and you need to make sure you did nothing to change that. I'm being hyperbolic, but they were complaining that Jesus was associating with the lowly and the sinners, the tax collectors. And I heard of a young preacher who went to his first work in Illinois. And he was not the strongest in the pulpit, and that is the most eloquent, but what he preached was truth. And he was tenacious with asking for Bible studies. And so he started converting spouses and family members of members of the congregation that had been supposedly working on these people for years. And some of the members started getting upset at that. They started grumbling. He's changing this church too much. There's too many people getting converted. It was my person to convert. I'm glad you laugh, but it really happens, unfortunately. And it reinforces what I said this morning. Congregations who are not accustomed to routine conversions eventually get to the point where they don't know how to convert anybody anymore. And they immediately think that somebody should just be able to read this and come up to my level of holiness right then and there, and forget that it's a messy process of slow change. The Pharisees and Sadducees were so upset with Jesus because Jesus was doing what they should have been doing, showing the needy and the poor and the sinners the way back to God. But instead of doing their job, they sat in their whitewashed temple and looked down upon the people. We can do the same thing if we're not careful. In John 6, you get people who are complaining, first, that where's the bread? And then secondly, the complaint that Jesus actually made some statements that you need to eat true bread, living bread, my teaching. And they didn't like that he said that because it meant no more physical bread, or so they thought. You go to John chapter 6, verse 26 here. So this is after he feeds the 5,000, he walks in water, and it's the next morning. And the crowd has followed him to the other side of the lake. And he says, Jesus answered and said to them, "Truly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled." He adds on, "Do not work for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you, for on him the Father God has set his seal." Now, some ask the right question, what shall we do in order to inherit this stuff? We look down at verse 35. He identifies what the true food is. He said, "I am the bread of life, and he who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. So he identifies himself as the bread of life, the true bread that they need to be working for, pursuing. You look in verse 41. Therefore the Jews were grumbling about him because he said, I am the bread that came down out of heaven. They didn't like that he said that, because it was an indication that he was sent from God the Father, that he might be God in the flesh, the long-awaited Christ. Look in verse 43. Jesus answered and said to them, do not grumble amongst yourself. No one can come to me unless the Father who has sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on that last day. And he continues on teaching about, again, the benefits of coming to the true bread. So you look down in verse 61, or 60. After this long section here verse 53 and 54, it's on the screen, apologize for that. But he doubles down on this point about him being the bread of life, which is said in verse 48. He says, truly I say to you, unless you eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, I live because of the Father, so he who eats me, he who also will live because of me. This is the bread which came down out of heaven. Not as the fathers ate and died, he who eats this bread will live forever. These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it? But Jesus, conscious that his disciples grumbled at this, said to them, does this cause you to stumble? What then if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he has been before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. But there are some of you who do not believe. Now 63 identifies what it means to eat the flesh and drink the blood. It's his teaching. It is the very essence of who Christ is. To be a disciple completely conformed to him. But people did not like that he said that. And sometimes, making the more practical point here is, sometimes people will grumble and complain when truth is taught. Everything that Jesus said here is 100% accurate, and people didn't like it. Sometimes the preaching steps on toes. I'm not saying that to try and give myself a pass on doing that, because right now all 10 of mine have been stepped on tonight in this lesson. But sometimes people grumble that truth was upheld or defended or error was exposed and refuted. And they grumbled. So let's bring this to a close. In Philippians chapter 2, of the apostles, Paul's life is pretty much an open book because his life is embedded in our New Testament. He wrote majority of it. His life is laid bare in the pages of 2 Corinthians and 1 and 2 Timothy and Philippians. And so of the apostles that we have their life recorded for us, we can say Paul, more than any other apostles that we have record of, had all the reason to complain. Lost all of his earthly status and goods. His health was failing towards him in his life. He was beaten, persecuted, afflicted, was betrayed multiple times. I think sometimes I forget the sting of when Paul writes in 2 Timothy to come to him quickly, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me. In earlier epistles, Demas is listed among the faithful members of Paul's traveling companions. How easy it would have been for Paul to at ships about his situation. But this apostle writes this in Philippians 2, starting verse 14. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so you'll prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain nor toil in vain. The Philippians, if they were to do all things without grumbling or complaining, they were going to prove a few things. First, they were going to prove themselves to be true children of God. That they would have the character and they would shine as lights in this dark and perverse generation, Paul says. Secondly, in verse 16, it would be proof that they were holding fast the word of life. And thirdly, it would be proof that Paul's ministry, his labors, were not an empty endeavor. That Christ had truly been formed in the Philippians, that his preaching was successful, his labors among them had borne fruit. But he says they do all things without grumbling or disputing, complaining. And we know what justifiable complaint is. In Acts 6 again. But I would say there's two things. If I'm going to offer a legitimate complaint to someone or about to the eldership or whatever, I think it needs to have two things with it. I need to air my concern in a manner that is speaking the truth in love and shows concern and care for my brother. That should go without saying. But I need to offer a solution, or a possible solution. And if I'm issuing the complaint, I need to understand that I'm volunteering to be part of the solution. It does no good to gripe and complain and moan and all this stuff if I'm not willing to be part of the solution. I heard at eldership one time, they had a lady that came in and she was upset that there was not enough visiting going on. And I said, well, we agree, and there should be more. Says, we need to form a group, and I want to be, and we need a group that goes out and does visiting, and probably needs to be a committee or something. Says, okay. One of the elders wrote down a list about 10, 15 members, slid it across the table, says, we agree. You lead it up. I don't want to do it. That's not the way you issue complaints. That's not how you deal with it. If you have a concern, you bring it up with the party that you're concerned about, or who can do something. You try and think of possible solutions to be part of the problem. Excuse me. You don't want to be part of the problem. You want to be part of the solution. And volunteer to be part of the solution. I see in Acts 6, I know we're running out of time, so I will just reference it. I see in Acts 6, people are concerned about the widows, that they were being overlooked of their daily food. And so there's a concern. There's a genuine concern. So they take it to the people who can do something about it. They take it to leadership and say, hey, the Hellenistic widows are being overlooked. And the leadership goes, that's a problem. But it's not good for us that we should neglect our duties in order to take care of this. So here's a solution. Find 6 men, 7 men who we can put in charge of this. And we can make sure it gets taken care of. The congregation was in agreement with that, and so the leadership gave the qualifications or what we're looking for, and they selected 7 men, and they said, okay, we're going to put this in charge of the task. It was dealt with. There was a willingness on everyone's part to be a part of the solution. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes people just want to complain for the sake of complaining. And I think Numbers 11 is pretty clear how God feels about complaining for the sake of complaining. So I want to offer a few applications here. 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. Paul says, examine yourself to see whether or not you're in the faith. Now he's dealing there with whether or not you stand in Christ. But I believe there's a principle there. When it comes to complaining stuff, murmuring and grumbling, I don't know where you all stand. And really, if you're married or close friends, your spouses and your friends really don't know where you stand on this. Only you can make that determination. And so all of us just need to take a look at what the scriptures say, what did Paul say in Philippians 2, and examine ourselves and see where we stack up. And I'll offer 3 practical applications or suggestions on how we can do better at this, and myself included in this. First of all, let's focus on what is right, good, and a blessing, not on what isn't. So I'm just going to identify the white elephant in the room. Sunday morning, we had 90-something. Bible class was 72-something. I'm not good at numbers. You all know this. There's about 40-something tonight. And there's some watching online and participating that way, in the way that they can. It would be very easy for me, and for all of us, to start griping about, well, brother so-and-so's not here, and sister so-and-so's not here, and this family's not here, and where are they at, and why are we the only ones that show up? And you could see how quickly it gets spiraling. Instead, let's focus on what's good, right, and blessing right now. We can assemble without fear that we are growing as a congregation, that we have a blessing, that the pandemic has eased enough where most of us feel comfortable and safe enough to be with our brethren, that we are back to all services, that we've added new faces and there's new converts, that the Lord's blessing us with more children in this congregation. You focus on the good, and the negative won't take you down. I myself have to do this sometimes. Some mornings you just wake up on the wrong side of the bed. I think Tuesday was one of those days for me. And I don't know about you, sometimes with me, the brain is, I have to think it's intrusive thoughts, not from myself. The regret game started playing. Well, if you would have done this differently, 5 years ago, you might be in a different situation. Or you don't have this, don't have that. And you can spiral out of control very quickly with that. And it seems so simple. Something we might tell our children, and us adults have a problem with that. Like, it's good for the 4-year-olds, but I'm more mature than that. I just started listing everything I was thankful for. I left my house, was driving to Elcon, about 10 minutes. And I had this knot in my gut when I left my house. By the time I got to Elcon, that knot was untangled. That foggy brain was gone. And I felt much better. Because I started focusing on what is right, good, and a blessing, not on what isn't. Because I can't control what isn't. Paul and I were talking about this morning after service about gardening. If you haven't gardened, try it sometime. It's frustrating. Because you can do everything right, and the plants still die. You can do everything right, and you get no fruit that year. And so it's a really testament of patience of, I'm glad for that one little miniature, deformed tomato growing on that one plant. Because I helped it grow. Focus on what's good. Secondly, let's have a 30-day complaint fast. Refrain from it. Why 30 days? Brenden needed to pick a number, so he picked 30. That's why 30 days. Or maybe go a week. Try it. Every time you feel the urge to complain, find something to be thankful for. So, right now, the gas prices. It's so easy to go to Costco, wherever you get your gas, and do the head nodding. You could say you're thankful for that you can still put gas in the tank. You still have money to pay for the gas and to put in the tank, and you're still able to drive. You might complain about the road construction, but especially on Broadway, how they're diverting Country Club right now. Be thankful for that. Hey, I finally get to see my tax dollars being put to work. You can be thankful that when this is done, it's going to be better transportation more smoothly. I might complain that the grocery price is a little bit too high. Well, I'm thankful that I can still buy groceries, because there's parts in the world right now that's not happening. Africa is in for a very rough year because of the war in Ukraine, who supplies most of their grain. No grain means can't feed the cattle, means you can't butcher the cattle for meat, means prices go up. We're still able to get steak on the table. You see how this goes. And finally, open our eyes to the endless possibilities that are before us. Because we have a habit of focusing on the negative, as Israel did so many times. When Israel just could not see, just a little over yonder was the land flowing in milk and honey. That if they were kept their eyes on God, in a short while, they would have been in the promised land. And yes, there's days where we don't like it. We have bad days, but you press on because you know bad days are not forever. An artist I listened to, he came out with a new song. I think it's called Bad Life, and it's kind of funny because the title has nothing to do with actually the meaning. The first line of the song is basically, we all have bad days. We remember that it's a bad day, not a bad life. That one day does not determine your entire trajectory. And so when it comes to grumbling and complaining, God wants us to be people of, if I may say, realistic optimism. That there is always something to be thankful for in the present. There is always something to give thanks to for God for what's happening here. And especially when we're around our brethren in a growing congregation, a larger congregation, we're going to rub against each other the wrong way sometimes. And especially when those things happen, we need to focus on what is happening right, what we can be thankful for, and focus on the positive. Focus on the positive. Maybe you're here tonight and look out, and I think all of us who are of age who have obeyed the gospel that I know of, but we do want to offer the Lord's invitation. Jesus came and died on the cross for your sins and my sins. That he endured more than any of us, and more than anyone probably had a reason to maybe offer a complaint once in a while, but he didn't. He, as the Hebrew writer said, gladly endured the shame for our benefit, that we might be reconciled to God. If you know that, you believe that, Jesus said that he that believes in me and is baptized shall be saved. But maybe you're here tonight and you're struggling. You need prayers of encouragement, prayers of restoration. If you have a spiritual need, won't you come forward? So we stand and sing the song that's been selected.